This week you will hear a lot of detail about the practical way to solve problems like housing, provision of transport, having communities that are sustainable, dealing with the environment. And all these issues are of fundamental importance, the detail of how to implement the reforms that we desperately need. My job is to place all of those micro solutions and problems in the big picture. We need to know, for example, how much time do we have to introduce the reforms that are of fundamental importance? Because if we have 100 years in which to make the changes, then we can take our time. But if time is short, then when we talk about strategic action, we need to bear in mind the timetable. Now, I'm going to present to you a terrible proposition, and it's not intended to be a joke. I'm deadly serious. It's my view that the objective conditions in the world today are driving the world to a world war. Now, this is so serious a proposition that it should not be made in public unless there is real reason to believe that there is a possibility that in the not too distant future, we might be ending up in a 21st century version of a world war. So it's my job to try and suggest to you a way of thinking that will enable you to decide whether my fears are reasonable or not. The trouble, you see, is that at the highest levels of government decision-making, the way they think about the world's problems is so damaged, so distorted, that they are not making the correct decisions. They couldn't make it when people like me were warning them that the world was heading towards a financial crisis. I gave them, or at least the British government, 10 years warning that this would happen, and they took no notice. They were sure that I was wrong, that this time there would be no boom bust. And we now know that the decision makers, the people who are still in power, believe that they can help to negotiate out of the global, and it is a global, depression. If that is the quality of the thinking of the people who have the power, then we should be very worried. So, why would I suggest that the objective conditions are such that we may be heading towards world war, and why is it that I think that it is possible to prevent that happening, but we don't have a lot of time? What I'm trying to tell you is that in discussing these issues over the next 2 or 3 days, please try and think about the possibility that we don't have a lot of time. Which means we then, if I'm correct, it means we have to try and construct our strategies in a way that pushes the agenda forward faster than otherwise would be the case. The first thing to understand is that capitalism is not the kind of creature that we've been taught to believe in. It is not a neoliberal system, which is the favorite phrase. It is not the worker against the employer, which Marx emphasized. The fundamental elements, the structure of the system, it is a dual system. It is not a single, not a homogeneous creature, social system. It is made up of two very distinct, two separate cultures. One is the value-adding culture. People work, they add value to the wealth of the nation, they create things, and that is a very productive, it is what we're about. But living next door to this culture is the other culture. It's the culture that preceded, came before the industrial entrepreneurs of the 19th century who exploited the workers. That description is correct, but for hundreds of years before that, the additional system or culture, what I call the predator culture, came into being and still continues to rule the world today. It started off on a small scale. It now controls our social and economic system. And it's that shift in the ratio between the value adders, the people who work to create wealth that makes us rich, and the people who extract the value from the system. It's that ratio between the two that is now causing a crisis that makes it impossible for capitalism as we know it to continue. So I share Marx's view that there is a contradiction in capitalism, but the analysis is a significantly different one. So we need to understand the basic structure of this thing called capitalism. We have the predator culture, and I'm delighted to say my book that is of that name is now available and on sale here in Buenos Aires in Spanish. And we have the value-adding culture. The problem with the predator culture, the culture that extracts value from the system, is that because the people who extract value don't have to work for the money they take out of the system, the avarice, the greed, has no limits. For the rest of us, we would love to be greedy, but we can only be greedy to the extent that we work, create wealth, and therefore can enjoy what we create. That puts a natural limit on our consumption. But for the people who extract value without working, there is no limit to how much they want to spend, how far they would go to capture more riches that belong to other people. Now, what is the nature of the value that these people are extracting? In order to make sense of history, there is one concept only that you need to understand, and it's the word rent. Rent is the surplus value after people have worked and taken their share, and after people have saved and invested capital and taken their share. After that, there is a surplus that's called rent. No one individual creates that value. It comes from the sky like a miracle to the people like me who own land. So we get rich by doing nothing. So if we get rich from doing nothing, and we just have the luxury of keep on spending, there is no limit to what we will do to capture more rents. And our behavior is shaped by that dynamic of being able to take without working, and then take more and more and more. And it's important to understand that there is this dynamic where there is no limit to how much we want to capture. The formation of this capitalist system began in the modern times, 500 years ago, in Spain, in England. They set sail to the New World to find lands. In England, the aristocracy captured the lands from the peasants. It was 500 years ago that the modern version of capitalism began. The ratio of the people who took rents out of the system was in favor of the people who worked. Most people in the world were value adders. They worked, they created wealth, and then there were a few people who said, we want to take the rents. And so this system could continue to operate because there were enough people working to create the rent that kept the people who were the landowners, like me, happy. But this created a culture that became very dangerous. It's an institutionalized process, and it works like this. If I am very greedy. I don't work for all that I receive, so I want more and more and more. There comes a point where I have to say, well, in England, we've taken all the land. We must now go to other continents. So the dynamic is triggered to create what is now known as colonialism. But there was an additional way for the people who took the rents to expand their control over that particular stream of revenue from their country. They could tell the people who were losing their land in their country, we don't need you in England, please go away. Go to Australia, go to New Zealand. So we had two forces at work during the colonial period. We could go and capture other people's land, and we could get rid of our own citizens who were no longer wanted because we would push them off the land and we didn't need them to work in the factories. So now we have a capitalist system that is fundamentally destructive. And it's worse than that, actually. What capitalism is a killing machine. Killing. And when I say killing, I mean that literally. When we talk about capitalism, usually people say, well, it's because the capitalists want profits and so on. And all of that is correct. But actually, capitalism is an institutionalized process for killing people. And that process still works today. And we have to factor that into our thinking if we want to understand what is going to happen over the next 20, 40 years. What is called the extensive appropriation of land, taking land from other continents, which is the colonial process, was grabbing land and killing people who were on the land there before we arrived. So we had to kill people or push them to the margins so that we could take their land. So that's one process of killing that is built into the system that we call capitalism, and it still works today. But there is a problem with this process, as I will explain in a second. The other process of killing is within our own countries. In the United Kingdom, for example, we get rid of about 50,000 people every year who die prematurely. So, for example, in a town called Blackpool, on the west coast in the north, babies born today who are boys will die, on average, 12 years earlier than baby boys born in Kensington or Chelsea in London. So we get rid of about 50,000 people every year within our own country. So this relieves the stress of the system. When things are not working, when there is not enough work for people, we solve the problem either by sending them to other countries, or we have structured the institutions and the values and the financial arrangements so that people die 12 years before they need. That's 12 years of life that people ought to be enjoying, which they aren't, and there's no reason why they shouldn't. So we have in capitalism a killing machine. It's to make profits. Yes, there is greed, but it's also destructive. We need to understand that this is not accidental, that the process is institutionalized. Because when we talk about a depression, and we've had two in the North Atlantic countries, in the 1870s and then in the 1930s, the consequence of those two depressions was a world war. We are now back into a depression. Why shouldn't we have another world war? Why did we have a world war after those two first depressions? There is no historical necessity why it should repeat itself. There have to be good reasons why we would think that because we are now in a depression, we will end up with another world war. Well, I've analyzed those two earlier world wars to try and understand what the historical conditions were. Now, the historical conditions are not enough to be able to say that it's going to happen again, because history doesn't have to repeat itself. Why should we have another world war now, and even worse still, and here I'm extending the analysis a little bit, perhaps I shouldn't, I won't. Why should we have another world war now? The First World War occurred for this reason. Capitalism had broken down. By the 1870s, it was impossible to sustain activity. And that's the definition of a depression, an extended, a long period of unemployment of a lot of people, capital being destroyed, resources that could be invested not being invested. How to get out of this situation? The European countries said, well, there is only one way. The logic of our capitalist system is we have to go and get more land from somewhere else, and we have to kill off a lot of people who we don't really need in Europe. So the first step was to cut up Africa. So this was an agreement among all the European powers who would take what in Africa. So that relieved part of the pressure of the depression of the 1870s. But the problem was that two countries lost out in that settlement, Germany and Italy, because they were late comers in the colonial project. So they didn't get as much as Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, and they were not very happy. And there were tensions, and there was only one way to solve that problem, and that was a war, which meant we got rid of a lot of people in Europe, and so the system could breathe again. After 1914, we could start to rebuild. Then we had the depression of the 1930s. Now, is the pattern there the same one? Yes. The policymakers, the governments, could not find a rational way out of the depression. So, on top of that, Germany was being made to pay reparations to other countries. Germany was suffering. How to get out of this situation? Go and take more land from other people. Germany thought, well, we can't go to Africa, we can't go to South America or North America, Australia belongs to England. We can take Poland, Czechoslovakia, Ukraine, so why don't we go and take the land from over there? Well, but that wasn't going to be allowed by the Allied powers, and so there was another world war. And a lot more people killed, and as a result of that, Europe boomed after 1945. We had the best period of production, high living standards for the first 20 years. It looked like we'd solved the problem. And there was never going to be another war in Europe because we decided we would have the European Union. The European Union was going to be a political settlement which would make sure that the stresses within Europe arising from this capitalist model would never again lead to stresses. There would not be fascist parties winning votes to get into parliaments in Europe again. There would not be authoritarian governments running countries like Greece and Spain ever again. They would not appoint technocrats to run Italy again, except they are doing all these things again. The fascists are getting votes, getting elected. Half the population of young people in Spain and Greece don't have jobs. There are terrible street marches, protests, and it's only just begun. Now, the problem for Europe is this. What are we going to do about it? In the past, the model was, the logic of the capitalist system was, we'll go and capture land from somewhere else. And that way we can send the people we don't want to live on those new territories. And we can take the rents, the natural resources from those countries and bring them back to Europe. And that will relieve some of the stress of a depression. Except we can't go to Africa now because China is buying all the land in Africa. We can't come to South America because you won't accept colonialism from Europe again. And anyway, China is buying up the rich resources in South America. So Europe is locked into a trap. It cannot hope to go and get resources from other people's territories to bring back to Europe to help to rebuild our economy. Are we going to start killing ourselves in order to relieve the social stresses? What is going to happen in Europe? Do you really believe that the people who are leading our countries have the capacity to think through the constructive solution? Because one does actually exist. They're not thinking about how to actually overcome the depression and rebuild the European homeland. Which means, from my point of view, that there is the very high risk of what I consider to be a forthcoming world war. Now, you might say, but look, this is pure fantasy, which is what they told Winston Churchill during the 1930s when he kept saying there's going to be a world war. They said to him, you are crazy, there's not going to be a world war in Europe again. Is the world so secure that we can feel confident that my nightmare is just a pure private nightmare, dream? Is the world so confident, so stable, that we can be confident that we have plenty of time to discuss important policy issues and persuade governments that they can finally reach their senses and introduce the good reforms that we will be discussing this week? Well, if there wasn't going to be a currency war, China threatens one. We don't know when that will be. If there wasn't going to be competition over the mineral resources under the Arctic ice cap, Russia is very alert to the risks of America coming and taking its mineral resources from the ocean underneath the ice cap. If there wasn't tension in the China Sea, China is creating problems for the Philippines and Japan over wanting to take territories in that part of the world. If there weren't going to be water wars over the next 10, 20, 30 years, if there was no problem with Islam and Christianity, and I could go on with this list, if these problems didn't exist, we would say this is a secure world. There can't possibly be a mistake made somewhere that will end up triggering a global conflict. But all those things do exist, and they can only get worse. And therefore, we have to presume the possibility, in my view, that with countries like Spain and Italy and Greece suffering terrible pain because there is no apparent solution to the rising unemployment, with China being an element that we can't quantify, we can't anticipate what she will do in the future. She is wanting to sell goods to Europe and America now, but there will come a point where she will no longer need to be courteous to the West. If all these things weren't in the melting pot, creating uncertainty, then we could think maybe it's going to work out. Eventually, the depression will end and we will have peaceful return to full employment. Well, I don't believe that's going to happen. So, we have two choices. We can let the present trends play themselves out. China will cause some kind of a war in the China Sea between the Philippines, Taiwan, or Japan. There will be conflict over extracting mineral resources under the Arctic. It has to be, because they are rich, and Europe needs them, and so does North America. But other countries like Russia also want their share. Do you really believe that they are capable of reaching sensible agreement for the common good? So the one choice is to leave things as they are, to continue the irrational way which in the past has resulted in killing and the conquest of other people's territories. The alternative. What is the alternative? The alternative is for countries like Britain to give up their colonial expansion, and the same with Spain, and this is the colonialism in the modern form, the financial variety, to give all that up and to go back to their own territories and to start to rebuild their societies from within their homeland. I've described to you the capitalist process or dynamic, which is extensive. When the predators, the rent takers, have exhausted their own opportunities in their homeland, they go elsewhere to capture other people's land, other people's territories. I'm saying it is possible, instead of having this extensive process, to have an intensive vertical development by rearranging the way we distribute income. And all I'm saying is allow people to keep what they produce and use what they don't individually produce, which is the rental stream of income, use that to fund public services. That very simple basic model alters the dynamic of the capitalist economy completely. So instead of being aggressive and destructive, it now becomes caring, come home, build from within, use efficiently our resources, conserve nature, liberate people's creative powers. This is a totally different model of social development. But why should our political leaders care, and why should they listen to us? Well, you know, over history, we've seen that this model has been advocated here in Argentina by someone you know better than I do, a guy called Rivadavia. Winston Churchill in Britain. Sun Yat-sen in China. The list is a long one. Today, Joseph Stiglitz will advocate this policy. So we know over history the policy has been on the table, but the politicians haven't taken the policy off the table and done something with it. And that includes your country, which is a great tragedy. We will be hearing more about that tomorrow. Now, if it's true that we face a crisis, is it possible that the history lesson tells us that if we go to the governments today and say, look, there is a risk of conflict, but here is a model of social development that is peaceful and leads to prosperity and begins to solve the problems that we have of unemployment and so on, will they listen? You only have to look at the history books to discover that no, the answer is they do not listen. In the 18th century, British government in deep debt, needed to get revenue, decided to tax their settlers in the New World in America. The settlers there said, we don't want to pay these taxes. Adam Smith said, look, you shouldn't tax the people in America, and the best way to raise revenue is from the land tax. The British government did not pay any attention to Adam Smith. We had an American Revolution, a lot of people died, and Britain lost 13 states in the colonies in the what is now the United States. We lost that because the British government didn't listen to Adam Smith's advice. What about over the water in France? France was also suffering stress. The people were very unhappy. The king said to his finance minister, a man called Turgot, what are we going to do? Turgot said, well, actually, we could solve the problems of the peasants and the people who work in the town. We've got to change the tax system. We need the land tax. No, said the king, we can't have the land tax. He ended up losing his head in the guillotine, the French Revolution. Go further east to Russia. The peasants in the 19th century were very unhappy. There were riots in the towns. It was obvious that there was going to be civil unrest and disturbances, maybe even a revolution. So the Tsar said to one of his favorite aristocrats, a man called Leo Tolstoy, who wrote War and Peace, what are we going to do? And Tolstoy said to the Tsar, well, actually, what you should do is listen to some of the Western thinkers, people like Henry George, John Stuart Mill. They said the way to get new dynamic economic development is to have a land tax. No, said the Tsar, we're not having that. So he and his family were taken into a basement underneath a house and shot, and we had the Russian Revolution. go further east still to China. Over the last 200-300 years, I think not. And that's why I'm very pessimistic. And there's only one way that we can force the issue, and that is for people in the streets demanding change. Ordinary citizens saying they are going to go round the politicians, around governments, and demand that there should be a change that leads to the kind of peace and prosperity that we desperately need. I can't go into any more detail. One little fact, a remaining one. I said I wouldn't talk about the logical conclusion that I would draw about my story, this narrative, because it goes beyond my brief, which is, I believe that what we're seeing is the end of the European model of civilization. We're seeing the decline of a civilization, and it's reaching the tipping point. It's come to the end. It's exhausted. We all want to be rent takers. We all want to live by having land values going up and up and up, which we can then put in our pockets without having to work for it and enjoy good lives. But most of us want to live like that, and there are not enough people who are creating the rents. So this is an impossible situation. It's just not possible for ordinary people like me who owns a home. I see my house going up in value. I think I'm very clever because I'm getting richer and richer every year without doing anything. But everybody wants to be like me, and nobody wants to, or very few people, not enough people, want to work to create the wealth that creates the rents so that people like me can live without having to work. And that's an impossible situation. It's happened at least once before, the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire did decline and fall, so there's no argument about that. Why did it decline and fall? Is there a similarity with our situation today? Throughout the period of the Caesars, the empire, we can see how land was being captured from the peasants, the rents were being collected by fewer and fewer people, and in the end, it was an empire that couldn't even create its own army from its own citizens because they had lost their farms. They were now living in the cities, not working. They were being supported with welfare. During those the 300 years leading up to the sacking of Rome, there were a group of people. They were the first Christian philosophers within the empire who said, look, there's something fundamentally wrong with the way our system works. You, the rich landowners, are taking the rents and you are creating poverty. The warnings came time after time after time, beginning in the 2nd century from a man called Clement of Alexandria. He was followed by John Chrysostom. He was followed by Ambrose of Milan, Basil the Great, and what is regarded as the greatest of the philosophers of that period, a man called Augustine. They all said the poverty that is creating the huge stresses in the Roman civilization is the direct result of taking the rents from the land and not allowing people to work, to create value, to be dignified human beings. The result was Rome had to hire mercenaries to man the armies, and the mercenaries were the ones who sacked the city of Rome in 410. Those Christian thinkers, the philosophers, relied on theology, that they were developing the critique of greed in that system, but the Caesars would not listen to them. And in the end, that civilization had to come to an end. Today we have science to support theology, but the politicians are still not listening.
My name is Juan Acevedo. I have a consulting firm which is called Acevedo and Associates. I repeat, my name is Juan Acevedo. I have a consulting firm specialized in engineering. Your presentation has been most enlightening. And I would like to ask you, in addition to the solution regarding the taxes on land, what other solution is there for this true disaster which you have so clearly portrayed, and whether that solution might lie in strengthening the United Nations organization through the elimination of the veto power by the 5 big nations and by the existence of a strong, powerful international court that will allow us to reach equality. There are issues here which go beyond the economic arena to enter the criminal field. This is the question I have for Dr. Harrison.
I'm sorry. The point is this: it doesn't matter how many governments say they agree with each other, no matter how many treaties they sign, petitions that they circulate, if the social and economic process is fundamentally wrong, then they will not be able to correct the elements of the structure. And you have to think of this as a structure. The social system is on foundations that are rotten, or at least half of it is rotten. The other half we have to preserve. And so, for instance, take the economic crisis today. You would think that there would be agreement in Europe and North America over how to deal with the financial crisis. There is no understanding of what even caused this crisis. They will talk about certain elements of the cause. They will talk about housing mortgages, subprime mortgages, overpriced houses. You heard Fernando say that in Spain, 1 million homes standing empty. But they say nothing about policy relating to housing, to solve the housing problem. They talk about, let's regulate the bankers. But the bankers were only doing what the law allowed them to do, which is what I, as a homeowner, are doing. I have benefited from the last boom and bust. I pocketed a lot of money without working. But nobody in the media, not in governments, not in parliaments, they don't say, Harrison is a greedy man, he made all this money out of his house, but he didn't work for it. There's no discussion about that. They think that if they re-regulate the banks, they will solve the problem. They won't. So we are now heading towards the next housing boom bust. And I can give you the dates of that cycle if you really want them, because they are written in history. So with the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN's own Declaration of Human Rights, says that we have a human right to everything in the world, except there is one 4-letter word missing from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And please tell me what that word is that's missing. You don't have a universal right to land. You can have everything else, but not land. So how can they possibly solve the problem?
That Argentina is a country which for the past 200 years has been living in a period of intermittent civil war, as was the case with Rome. On the 100th anniversary of our independence, there was a President, Roque Sáenz Peña, who afforded universal suffrage, but said that for democracy not to be explosive, it had to be accompanied by the tax reform which you have described. Of course, that tax reform was never implemented. He died unexpectedly. The law was never enacted, and Argentina continued engaging in this intermittent civil war. Just some data. Brazil has a crime rate of 45,000 crimes a year as a result of the brutal inequality existing in the country. So Brazil is in a period of civil war. There's genocide every single year in Brazil, and it's not just because of children who die out of hunger, but people who die in armed conflict. Mexico, for example, which has a crime rate far below Brazil's, between 6,000 and 7,000 people a year. Yesterday, 49 people were hanged from a bridge whose arms and extremities had been amputated. And this is a clear demonstration of the monster that is being engendered and the fact that the new world conflicts will result from these problems precisely. Problems to which we should not be alien. What about the London fires last year? What about the fires in the outskirts of Paris? All these may be incremented manifold explosively. Let me remind you that 20 years ago, when a military rule was cornered by the hordes, in just 5 minutes they decided a war. They decided to invade the Malvinas, Falkland Islands, which ended up in a war. This, the assumption that this might happen was non-existent. However, the existing situation, the existing tension, and the people going against the military rule was the determining factor in deciding this war. And I agree with you that unless we become truly aware of the seriousness of this matter, events will surprise us. And it's the butchers that come out of these situations, those who do what has to be done and those who do what politics mandate them to do, emerge as mushrooms after rainfall.
The paper that you are presenting tomorrow will be very important for the audience to understand in detail what you are saying, and so I'm looking forward to that. Yes, you are correct. You see, these are all symptoms of the global world war that I think is now going to happen. The two first world wars were not world wars, they were continental wars, they were European wars. This one is a world war, and that's why it's not so easy to imagine the form it will take, but it will include all the sorts of things you're saying.
I'm a criminal justice servant in Córdoba, and I'll be brief. I loved your speech, and I would like to quote 3 things. One from Jean de la Brugère, a Frenchman, who said that in witness of disgrace and somebody else's misery, you take shame in being happy or in being successful. This relates to capitalism. The people who applaud this wild capitalism, people who lead a happy life. I mean, you may not feel happy if you see misery in others. Another quote is from T.C. Eliot, an Englishman, but who also lectured in Harvard, who said either the world changes or it won't be called world any longer, but rather it will be called hell, barren land, or desert. And concluding, the world is really a tough one. And as Mahatma Gandhi said, the only solution is not a single path to peace. Peace is the path. Congratulations.
Keep in our minds at all times is that we do have a choice. We have seen from history that the people who made the bad choices did have the alternative presented to them. They chose not to take the alternative that would have saved their countries. And we have that choice now. Understanding the nature of choice and how it can affect the destiny of a nation is really important. And you could explore that issue here in Argentina, because your country has 2 histories. It has the history since the 1820s that you read about in the history books, but it has the history that you could have had if the decisions made in the 1820s were slightly different on the question of taxation. Fernando could tell you more about that. Remember, Argentina could have had a second history where there would be no poverty, no reason to fight, no reason to kill. Why didn't it have that history? That was the lost history. But you need to understand it, because if you do, you can now begin to change the future.
I find it difficult, truly difficult, to understand what this new world war will be like. I don't quite understand it. It cannot be an atomic war, because this would call the destruction of the world. But then, if it is not an atomic world, what kind of war could it be? We don't see any opposing powers, as was the case with the Nazi Germany or the fascist Italy, facing and opposing to the other European democracies. We have countries like China today, which are semi-capitalist, not fully capitalist, who have a certain understanding of the Western world. So what I always ask Fred is, okay, maybe we are heading for a World War, but what will this war be like? And this is what I would like you to clarify.
The only way to come to a conclusion, an answer to that question, is to analyze history and the future trends by thinking about the dynamics of rent. That's the tool, the concept that begins to open up the future. In my next book, I'm sorry to have to mention this, I do begin to explore these issues in more detail. We don't have the time to go into satisfying Fernando with a full answer to his question. But just remember this, the First World War wasn't going to happen, and then one madman shot an archduke, and the world was at war. It was as simple as that. But it wasn't the one bullet that killed one man that created the World War. This was just the trigger, the event that provoked what was going to happen anyway. So if my analysis is correct, it's going to happen anyway. It doesn't matter what the bullet is, which gun, who fires it. It could be North Korea. It could be one of the Middle Eastern countries with a rocket that went wrong that landed in Washington. Who knows what it will be? We don't, but it doesn't matter. The important thing is, are the social and economic conditions today so fragile, are the stresses in the system so ready to cause the whole structure to collapse that it only takes an accident, one madman, one ship colliding with another ship in the wrong sea? The answer is, look, I don't think the World War will be like the last two. It won't be fought with conventional weapons. It doesn't need to be. China could destroy half of the United States by using cyberspace weapons. They only have to stop the energy system working throughout the grid, the power grid in America. All the computers would collapse. The heatings would be turned off. Traffic would be stuck in the cities. The war is over. What happens then? See, we're talking about the future. And this is where the Hollywood imagination is more likely to tell us what is going to happen in the future than someone like me looking in the history books. But the key thing is, where are the stresses in the system? And they relate to the concept of rent and the way that this fight over this income is causing the collisions. And those collisions are happening all over the world, just like the earthquakes that send tidal waves over Japan and destroy whole regions. It's like that. And unless we begin to think about it and make a credible case, because you have to be responsible if you're talking about these issues. Otherwise you are treated as an idiot, a madman. But somebody has to start thinking about it, because it's too late when we're down the road of... We've got so many young people unemployed in Spain, Ireland, Greece. Why don't we make them join the army? Why don't we start building naval ships We need naval ships down in the Falkland Islands. Let's start rebuilding our navy. Once we start to do that kind of thing, we are too far down the road, and we have to stop it getting that far. That means people like you have to begin thinking about it, because we won't be able to do it by ourselves. So I'm sorry that I can't answer Fernando's question sensibly, but I'm sure that pretty soon a clear answer will be presented to him, and that will give him a lot of sleepless nights. I guess the question is, should we be thinking about utopian solutions or being practical? We are not. Those of us who advocate a change to the tax system are not utopians. The problem with the big thinkers in the past, the utopian thinkers like Thomas More, Plato, and the others, is that they thought that the solution was, this is an evil world, let's go and create a heaven on this island in the ocean over there, a mythical place. And they constructed this heaven on earth on their little island as if they were not living in the real world. And we can't do that. We have to start from where we are today in towns like this one and start changing things so that everybody gains. So escaping into the... there's a very interesting answer to that question, if I've got a second. During the late Roman period, a lot of people did exactly as my friend said. They dropped out. They went away from the cities and they lived in the countryside. They became the Amorites, if I'm not mistaken. And out of that movement grew what then became the monastic life. The monks and the nuns lived in seclusion in the countryside, doing service to the people. So while the Roman civilization was collapsing, within that very civilization there were the seeds of the future civilization, because those people became the learned people. They studied, they thought philosophy, they helped their local communities. So what looked like an escape into unreality, escaping out of the urban civilization of Rome, which was so rotten, came something good. But I would rather that didn't happen to our civilization. I would rather our cities started to change from within.
My first remark is the following. When you study history and see wars, no significant war has been equal to the one preceding it. We cannot really foresee how this new war may be. We can do or make a great effort to foresee it, but we can't. My idea is the following. It is not worthwhile wasting so much energy to imagine how this new war would be, stemming from the fact that, as you, Fred Harrison, has said, from the fact that we're not having a war tomorrow or in 5 years' time, maybe in 20 years' time, but you, Fred, have shown us facts that are true, and we have to correct these issues. So maybe we should be concerned about correcting the actual situation, taking remedial action. How can we change the seeds with which we are sowing the current world and seed a new world? Here at the School of Law of the University of Buenos Aires, we can start sowing the new seeds of hope. Our school is different from many other schools of law. I am a professor of law. I'm interested in economics. Training the intelligentsia that should be making contact with governments and politicians so as to persuade them of this need, to find remedial and corrective action is very important. So this is the reason why I think that academia is very important. But what is happening at universities, higher education? Here at the School of Law, there is no single subject in the curriculum, graduate or postgraduate, where we study this topic, land value capture, or the concept of land. But I went to Mexico and to the USA, and I have noticed that the same thing happens there. No university or academic curricula includes the concept of land and everything we have been discussing. This is very important, in my opinion. I think that if we continue under such stress, we are going to have a third war, but experiences we have had before wars have shown us that dictatorships, tyranny, coup d'etats have been reiterating in the course of history once and again, and especially in the 20th century. The 20th century is an epitome of authoritarian regimes that thought that they were able to correct the situation. Fred, I fully agree with you. Politicians and governments have not lived up to expectations. They are not able or qualified enough to put in place such measures because, of course, there's universal voting. Anyone can choose the members of government. So, in my opinion, academic training, education, higher education is of the essence. The contemporary world is a world where actors and players are states. The states are in the hands of people having economic notions and conceptions that are absolutely alien to land and land value capture. And legal experts and jurists and law specialists just make laws but do not have no ideas. In Argentina, between 1862 and 1910, reached its peak summit in the field of economic development, immigration streams. You can see the buildings that we have put up in Buenos Aires. But somebody has to wonder about the number of laws that were enacted. 262, only 260 laws, including resolutions by the central bank and resolutions by the Ministry of Economy. But in the 20th century, Argentina entered a period of decline. So I have seen that ever since 1930 up until the year 2000, we in Argentina enacted 25,000 laws. This is legislative inflation. Ignorance of the law, absolute ignorance of the law about what is true and false, what is right and wrong. This is a new field of action. If I am still here teaching, I am a retired professor, it's because I think that we have to educate the people, because otherwise, Fred, my dear Fred, here, people living in slums think exactly as the richest capitalist. They are always speculating. As you very well said, Fred, this is the predator culture. And how can we correct this predator culture? Education is a gate, a door to correcting. The other door is violence. Let's go down to brass tacks. Let's teach the sovereign people.
The academic world needs to be revolutionized as much as the political world, the media, all levels of our life. And what you've heard from Dr. Sandler demonstrates the chaotic nature of our political and social system. We are told we must conform to the rule of law, as if this was a sacred idea. And it's one way to intimidate people to conform to the norms of society. But no one asks, whose rule of law are you asking us to conform to? And it's the teachers like Dr. Sandler who can say, well, there are bodies of thought, philosophies, ideas of natural law that are superior to the positive laws that are passed by governments, but we need to recover that knowledge, that wisdom, the ancient wisdom, and help people to understand. And how do we do that? It's a big problem. But you're filming this event. This is valuable tool for reaching people. If you use this material on YouTube, for example, you get a lot of people to begin to think about maybe there are serious questions they should be asking themselves.
Una última pregunta para realizar.
Buenas noches. Hola, hola. Buenas noches. Ezequiel de Freijo, yo soy contador público y economista. Y un poco, digamos, en la línea de la pregunta anterior, no solo la cultura, me parece también el tema de la ética, ¿no? De la ética en los funcionarios públicos, sobre todo, digamos, en los políticos también. La pregunta era cuál era el rol que podía haber en la religión para modificar esas conductas que usted estaba mostrando que, digamos, era lo que estaba debilitando el capitalismo de avaricia. ¿Cómo lo ve eso? ¿Qué experiencias tiene respecto de eso?
This is a difficult question because in the secular age, people don't want religion or the ethics that come from the spiritual life to be part of the agenda. So the scientists, the most distinguished scientists in the world, say that we can solve the problem of what it means to be human by ignoring metaphysics, ignoring spiritual issues. Well, you're asking me, do I think that's possible? And the answer is no. The scientific community is part of our problem. They see, they define what it is to be human in such a narrow way that they are leaving out large parts of what it means to be human. And people, even those who claim to not believe in God, for example, still retain something of the spiritual in them. Now, what is that, and how would it motivate change? We need to explore these questions. To illustrate the scale of the problem, to come back to Dr. Sandler's question about academic life, the scale of the problem in the United Kingdom, in the economic departments of our universities, there is only one man who would understand what we're talking about, who is a professor. One man in all of the universities in Britain who has any idea of the essence, the nature of the problem, and he happens to be sitting here today. In the whole of our university in the United Kingdom, he's the only one who can talk to you about these issues and make sense of the dynamics of the economy. Isn't that a profound disgrace that we have only one man in Britain that we can draw on to talk about what he's talked about and write about it? This shows you the scale of the challenge we face in trying to educate future generations. And it's the same in the spiritual life. We hear nothing from our religious leaders about Leviticus chapter 25, which tells people, look, we have to share the land. We have to cancel debts. We have to restore the land to the people who lost it. It's a simple message. It's in the Bible, and the spiritual leaders are not teaching it. So how can we rely on them to develop ethics in the way that would then shape economics? We are in a huge mess. And that's why I feel so pessimistic. And I just have to hope that there are enough people willing to occupy the public spaces, as some of them are now doing in Europe and North America, who are saying we just won't accept anymore what's being done to us. We're going to sit in these public spaces and we're going to talk and talk and talk until we find some answers. But we need that all over the world and we need a lot more of it. And we need people like you to be doing that, because otherwise the politicians won't listen.
When you look at damage to your world, do you want change? Don't have to do what you think you're supposed to do all day. There can be another way, and we can change our world. Start